There is a catastrophe so complete that it erased an entire era of human civilization in less than 50 years. Around 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age world of the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed, not gradually, not through a slow decline that historians can trace across centuries. It collapsed the way a structure collapses when too many load-bearing walls fail at once, suddenly, completely, and with very little warning visible in the record before it happened. The Hittite Empire, which had fought Egypt to a standstill and produced the world's first surviving peace treaty, disappeared so abruptly that its capital city was burned and never rebuilt. The Mycenaean palace civilization of Greece, which had produced the world that Homer would later describe in the Iliad and the Odyssey, went dark. Its palace centers at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos were destroyed or abandoned. The linear B writing system, the earliest form of Greek, vanished from the record for centuries. The great trading city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast was burned and left permanently uninhabited. Cyprus was attacked and partially depopulated. Egypt survived, barely, under Ramesses III, who repelled an invasion on its northern borders and recorded the event in temple inscriptions at Medinet Habu that are among the most dramatic documents in ancient history. In those inscriptions, Ramesses identified his attackers. He called them the Sea Peoples. He described them in terms that conveyed both the scale of the threat and the Egyptian pride in having repelled it. And he depicted them in carved relief on the temple walls in scenes of naval battle and land combat that are the most detailed military imagery surviving from the Bronze Age. And then, for 3,000 years, the question of who they actually were remained one of the most contested and unanswered problems in all of ancient history. The Sea Peoples appeared in the Egyptian records as a coalition of groups with names that scholars have been arguing over ever since: the Peliset, the Cheker, the Shiklesh, the Denine, the Weshesh. Some of these names appear to correspond to populations known from other sources. The Peliset are widely believed to be the Philistines of the biblical record, the people who settled the southern Levantine coast and gave their name, eventually, to Palestine itself. The Denine may be related to a people known from records in Anatolia. Others remain entirely unidentified despite a century of scholarly effort. What the Egyptians recorded was not a single origin for these groups, but a coalition, peoples who came, in Ramesses' words, from the islands and from the sea, who had already destroyed the Hittites in Cyprus and the cities of the Levantine coast before they reached Egypt. The last known letter from the king of Ugarit, written just before the city's final destruction, describes ships attacking the coast and the city's army being away in Hittite territory. The letter never received a reply. The city was burned so thoroughly that its destruction layer is visible to archaeologists as a stratum of ash 3,000 years later. For most of the 20th century, the dominant theory placed the Sea Peoples' origin in the Aegean, in the world of Mycenaean Greece and the broader Aegean Bronze Age civilization. The idea was that the collapse of the Mycenaean world had itself produced refugees and displaced warriors who then moved eastward and southward, attacking and destabilizing the remaining palace civilizations they encountered. Collapse producing collapse, a cascade of destruction in which the first victims became the next aggressors. It was a compelling model. It had the virtue of explaining the timing. And it was built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. Because no text, no inscription, no ancient record had ever identified the Sea Peoples by their own name or their own words. They left no account of themselves. The only record we had was the record their enemies left, the inscriptions of the people they attacked, and then the ancient DNA arrived. A landmark study published in 2019 in the journal Nature, conducted by a team from the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, Harvard University, and multiple Israeli and European institutions, extracted and analyzed ancient genomes from individuals buried at Ashkelon, one of the major cities of the Philistine coast, in what is today southern Israel. The site had been excavated over many years and contained burials spanning a period from before the supposed Sea Peoples' arrival through the early Iron Age. What the genetics showed was, in the specific and careful language of the study, a European-related ancestry component that appeared in the population at Ashkelon, at precisely the time the Philistines, identified as sea peoples in the Egyptian records, were supposed to have settled the coast. Before that period, the individuals buried at Ashkelon showed a genetic profile consistent with the local Canaanite population of the Bronze Age southern Levant. After that period, the population showed a clear admixture of ancestry whose closest parallels were populations in southern Europe, specifically populations genetically related to Bronze Age individuals from Greece, Sardinia, and the broader Aegean world. The European ancestry component appeared in the record suddenly, at the moment of the supposed Sea Peoples settlement, and then gradually diluted over subsequent generations as the incoming population mixed with the local Canaanite population they had settled among. Within a few centuries, the distinctive European signal had largely disappeared into the broader Levantine ancestry profile of the region. The Philistines, in other words, had arrived intermarried and been genetically absorbed by the population they had come to live among. But before that absorption was complete, their European ancestry was visible in the bones they left behind. This is the finding that changes everything, because it does several things simultaneously. It confirms the Aegean origin theory for at least one of the major Sea Peoples groups, placing the origin of the Philistines in the southern European and Aegean world, rather than in the Near East itself. It explains how a population could arrive, establish a distinctive material culture that archaeologists have been studying for a century, and then gradually lose its genetic distinctiveness as it merged with the surrounding population. And it raises the question, still unanswered, of what actually caused these populations to leave the Aegean and move east in the first place. The Mycenaean world that collapsed around 200 BCE was not simply destroyed by outsiders. It was already under profound pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Climate data from the period, including pollen records from lake sediments and isotope analysis from cave formations across the eastern Mediterranean, shows evidence of prolonged drought and reduced rainfall across a zone stretching from Greece through Anatolia and into the Levant. The palace economies of the Late Bronze Age were extraordinarily fragile systems, dependent on long-distance trade for essential commodities, on surplus agricultural production that drought could eliminate in a single bad season, and on political stability that the inscriptions suggest was already fraying in the decades before the final destructions. Hittite records from the years just before the empire's end describe grain shortages serious enough to require emergency imports from Egypt. The system was failing from within before it was struck from without. The Sea Peoples may have been not simply invaders, but refugees, populations displaced from a collapsing Aegean world, who moved eastward in search of land and resources, bringing their families and their livestock and their material culture with them, and carrying the European ancestry signatures of their Aegean origin into the Levantine coast, where some of them eventually settled permanently and built the cities that archaeologists have been excavating for over a century. The question the data cannot yet fully answer is whether the other Sea Peoples groups, the ones whose settlements are less clearly identified archaeologically, showed similar genetic profiles. The Ashkelon study covered only the Philistines with genetic precision. The broader coalition that attacked Egypt and destroyed the Hittites remains, in genetic terms, still largely unsequenced. Work continues on sites in Cyprus, in Anatolia, and along the Levantine coast that may eventually provide the genetic picture of the coalition as a whole rather than of one of its constituent groups. But what the 2019 study established, with the kind of evidence that no interpretation of an Egyptian temple inscription could ever provide, is that the Bronze Age collapse was not simply a mysterious external catastrophe imposed on a stable world. It was the product of a connected and fragile system, an interconnected Bronze Age economy of palace centers and long-distance trade routes and specialized agricultural systems that when it began to fail, failed everywhere at once. And the people who moved through that failing world carrying their Aegean ancestry into the Levantine coast, were not simply destroyers. They were also, in the most human sense, survivors. People who had lost their world and were trying to build another one in the wreckage of civilizations they had not entirely meant to destroy. The DNA in those Ashkelon burials is the evidence of that attempt. It shows a population arriving with its own ancestry, its own culture, its own set of material practices that archaeologists have documented in extraordinary detail. And then over generations blending into the world it had entered until the genetic trace of the crossing was no longer visible. The Sea Peoples were never simply what we thought. They were never a mysterious horde from an unknown origin descending on a stable civilization from outside history. They were part of the same interconnected world that collapsed around them, displaced by the same forces that destroyed the civilizations they then appeared to attack. The Philistine women buried at Ashkelon with European ancestry signatures in their bones had not chosen to be part of a historical catastrophe. They had chosen or been forced into a migration that ended on a coast that was not their origin. Their children grew up speaking the languages of the Levant. Their grandchildren had genetic profiles, increasingly indistinguishable from the Canaanite population that had been there before them. The European ancestry that the 2019 study detected in those early Philistine burials was gone from the population within a few centuries, absorbed into the broader genetic landscape of a region that has always been a crossroads. But for a brief window, visible now only because ancient DNA can read what bones alone could not say, it was there. The evidence of a crossing, the biological record of a world ending in another world, imperfectly, beginning in its place. The DNA is now telling us that the greatest catastrophe of the ancient world was not a mystery imposed from outside, it was a human story. The story of people caught in a collapse they did not fully cause and could not fully stop, moving through a dying world toward whatever came next, carrying in their bodies the ancestry of everything they had lost. That is not a mystery solved. It is a mystery made human, and that, in the end, is what the genetics always does.